As usual, have a little bit of a controversial conversation, not a very long one, because sometimes we do quite long ones. But I've been in this really deep inquiry lately, not just about my own path and about what I eventually had to do to start to keep myself together, which comes and goes. But we called it Shadows of Light, the conversation. It's just because essentially all light creates shadows. And I guess the conversation that we're in is modern spirituality. And I'm not talking about religion. I'm talking about where we've all gone with this new age and the shamanic movements and all of this. Is modern spirituality delivering what the average person actually needs in their depth of their struggle? We're going to discuss what could be going on, but is it delivering? And that's the question. And really, it's just an inquiry. It's just a question that we're creating. I think those who've listened to me speak before know that I do not for a second believe that I have it figured out. But I think when we stop questioning where we are, that we can get ourselves into quite a lot of trouble. So I ask you to just go into that questioning state. I'm not sure who it was that said that all ideas should be taken into the mouth like a fine wine and then possibly spat out at the end, but that we must be palatable to ideas. And the idea of Shadows of Light is essentially that the more we're growing in this supposedly light community, which I do believe in many places is very well intentioned, that a lot of shadows would creep in. And one of the problems with modern spirituality, because we're going to have a little bit of a look at how it's developed, and it sounds boring, but it's actually quite exciting to look at where these ideas came from, is that it gives us the right to pick and choose. And the problem with picking and choosing is that, of course, you will pick and choose the things that do not really create that state of metamorphosis for you. In other words, it's really easy to slip through the cracks in the state of information. We are in an information age, and there is incredible versions and variations of everything being birthed at every second, and you can get so lost in what is going on, and one day you're on this absolute high because something's making a lot of sense to you. But because we are so permeable to, because we are sitting so much in the mind, then what happens is we are susceptible to any form of idea, which therefore means that 2 weeks later, a new idea can scare you so much. And I can tell with the people I work with what kind of information they've recently interacted with, because they very often come and just from where they were in a state of empowerment and feeling completely untouchable, they're now in a state of fear. So we're going to have a critical look at spirituality itself. And critical doesn't mean to be of criticism. It means critical as in like to spread it and open it and to look at it. But essentially, I am making quite a big assertion here. And I'm saying that somehow in modern spirituality, we've lost accountability. And in losing accountability, we've lost the disciplines that we do need. And it's probably not what you're going to think. But I know myself that discipline has not been a really big thing for me. But essentially, at the core of it, I'm going to suggest that we are bypassing our humanness majorly, that there is so much going on that is so ethereal. In other words, we're all building castles in the sky, and none of it is helping us with what is at hand. So let's jump into it immediately, because it's really a very simple conversation. But essentially, that seems to be my favorite word. I remember I laughed so much last time because when I rewatched one of the talks to look for something, I used the word imagine like 50 times. I always seem to pick one word. If we take this contrast and we think about all the great, great writers and great speakers that we know of in the last few thousand years, there's a very common thing that shows up. This idea, if you can imagine this tree of life that has these branches up into heaven, and the tree also having the branches down into hell. And there's this idea where these writers, and I literally have a list of almost 30 quotes by the top guys I can think of that speak of this idea, where to hit some form of enlightenment, if this thing exists, right? Or some sort of emergence and breaking through, or some sort of a transformation, that essentially the only way to do it was to go into hell. Now, that's a very controversial idea, but it's not my idea. And everyone up to even Jung spoke about this. And I mean, what would hell be? For most of us, we don't really know. It's a generic term. And of course, we lose a lot in what we could call semantics, the way that we think words are just symbols for something. But if I say hell, a lot of people have this idea of, I think I've been there, or I think of an idea of how it feels, because we're talking about an embodiment of some form of hellish state. And what's extraordinary, if we could use some modern dialogue for what a lot of these people are talking about, the one I was reading most recently was Siri Aurobindo. Siri Aurobindo, very hard name to say, but most of you know who this is. And to essentially access what you really wanting, you really have to go into some form of darkness. Of course, we have in the modern day certain terms for this. We speak about the dark night of the soul and certain things. But one thing that, in my opinion, is not really showing up in the general narrative of love and light and etc., is this idea that if something starts to completely go wrong in your life, you are not necessarily lost. Okay. And using our modern terms, what we discover is that to travel towards that point that all these great speakers and psychologists were speaking about is almost to enter your own state of shame, to enter your ultimate weaknesses, to almost begin to embody. Okay. And of course, this might be happening on a personal level, which is what they spoke about, but this might actually be happening on a global level now. So it's quite an intense conversation to begin with, but we have almost this culture in modern spirituality, particularly in the new age, of not really feeling like we fit. And I'm saying we, I'm going to say I, when I am going through extreme periods of darkness. I've always joked that it's really easy to be in your yoga club when you're not waking up in the morning and eating a whole chocolate cake and sticking your finger down your throat, or doing cocaine, or because you're so, I don't know what it is, what your darkness is, but our general, let's call it a container, it doesn't really have place for these things. And I believe that if we had actually been listening to the ancient wisdom, we would know that these are the beings that are going to break through, those that finally admit their shame and embody it and begin to actually accept that there is nothing higher than the human experience for us. And how do we know this? Because we're here right now at this time. And what this idea is really taking hold, that something's wrong and we're not in a real reality. And all these things are just complicating us from the simple fact that we need to integrate, embody, become, like one of my favorite terms of this week, because we're working on this transformation workshop, is I am simply human. And to get present with that. So there's almost the shameful space of that we're not building spiritual containers that are holding space for that or possibilities for that. And the narrative, the way we have twisted creating your own reality, and we have this new modern cookie cutter version of this, that when we see someone in a deep struggle, we actually, if we're very honest with ourselves, and this doesn't apply to everyone, I'm trying to trigger, and if there's nothing there for you, then that's fine. If you're not wearing a yellow raincoat, and I keep speaking about it, you'll just be listening. And if it's you wearing a yellow raincoat, you'll go, oh, okay. So I'm talking about the fact that these spaces are not necessarily held. And in some ways, I think in a perfect world, there would be a way to really admire. There's some judgment that passes through our mind when we see this. And this is the modern programming of spirituality. Oh, he can't keep his life together. And as someone who has seizures and has a version of bipolar and all sorts of stuff, which I've been battling with my whole life, I know that I am in an integrous journey. I know what it is that I'm trying to do and what I'm trying to integrate. And I can speak for myself. There's no space for me in these kind of wishy-washy, spiritual spaces. So I want to take a really short journey on how it is we took original ideas, because we are already kind of a quarter way of what I want to discuss with you. So the original ideas, where they've actually come from and how they've become whatever it is today, considering this idea that we actually supposed to, if we really on the path of the initiates, go through these extreme initiations. Even in shamanism, it shows up where they talk about the piercing of the heart, the piercing of the mind, which means that you will be devastated in your heart in one of your lives, and that you'll be devastated in your mind. And that's if you are traveling. It shows up in Hinduism that as your energy rises, there is a great initiation of each of the energy centers. These are not my ideas. I'm simply pointing out that we have pushed this conveniently away. And how does this happen? So, how we've got there, it's not going to be a history lesson, but if you go back to the ancient Egyptians, and we know this for a fact, and you look at the mystery schools that were in the last part of their dynasties, because we have the information, and you look at how it then influenced the ancient Greeks, it's a well-known fact that Pythagoras, many of these great people, Socrates, Plato, actually at one stage went south, and that they went into these mystery schools, and they took these ideas, which essentially nowadays, it started off as Hermetics, I think, became the Hermetics. And the Hermetics were essentially these guys, and this was showing up very similarly all over the world. These were guys of a priesthood who had dedicated their lives to improving science, which is the physical, and understanding the counter laws, which is the etherical. In other words, they studied both science and both God at the same time. And they had to literally prove themselves to do this. Now, what's fascinating is that influences the whole of society. It is absolutely known who essentially were Hermeticists. And we'll get into that now, because for us to see how we got to this problem, we actually have to realize that this was the accepted wisdom that has given us almost everything. But before we move on, I want you to just think about that. Paracelsus, Isaac Newton, Carl Jung, I mean, we could jump, Plato, Socrates, we could jump everywhere. They all kept kind of what you would call the Hermetic philosophy. And the Hermetic philosophy coming from Egypt, one extraordinary thing was, first of all, that there were laws of the physical world and that there were laws of the unseen world. Not hard to believe, right? Because we've still got these modern pieces of these laws, which we have conveniently chipped out to make sure that we don't have to hold too much of an accountability. Which is why I open so strongly about the fact that, according to them, the journey is into their own personal hell. Sounds a little bit scary, but it's happening to us regardless. And do we actually have a narrative to hold this? So this is kind of where things get interesting, is that their unseen laws were as scientific as their seen laws, and they believed that there were so many, so did the South Americans, that there were essentially these cycles that the planet goes through. And every time the planet went through a cycle, it would birth a deeper understanding, and we would go into a new era of man. This is accepted in astrology, Eastern astrology, Hinduism. You get what I'm saying? I don't want to make this an hour talk, but when I say this was the accepted idea, they believed, it changed slightly per region, that there were 7 unseen laws that they knew of. And in these 7 unseen laws, what was fascinating was that they believed that there are actually 9, and that the next 2 would reveal themselves in the next hundreds and thousands of years, or I don't actually know what the timeline is. So we're talking about these laws. Now, what was fascinating about that is at some stage, there was this massive split in the 16 to 17, 1800s, where a huge philosophy started to be born, where the atomists came around. But if in simplicity, what happened was that religion and science began to split. And we need to realize that for thousands of years, the study of how something physical actually worked. They started to discover atoms. Paracelsus literally invented chemistry, because he knew that God was so complex that you could actually get closer to him by studying the way physical things worked. Not just atoms, not just chemistry. The Hermeticists literally birthed medicine, Western medicine as we know. But what was exciting is when they discovered, oh, water behaves like that because of this. And to them, it was not an exploration away from God. It was an affirmation of God. And the more complicated the universe seemed, and the more you dived into, which is a lot of the guys I spoke about did astronomy as a subject. It was always a subject because it was believed that once you could see how the planets were actually dancing and how they were aligned and balanced and how stars were being rebirthed, you could only sit in the wonder of God. So do you see how married they were? Then they also had their 7 unseen laws. And the deeper they got in their understanding of how amazing how amazing these physical laws are. You run into a wall, and no matter what, the law is impermeable. You will break your nose. That's simple. And to them, the unseen laws were just as impermeable. So just to we have an idea there, and then the split happens. And the split is devastating, because essentially what's happened is we only have 2 types of minds now. It's a big generalization, but we're just trying to push buttons and trigger. Essentially, you have the mind that is absolutely obsessed with how mechanical things work, even though those were just laws. They were quite accepting of that. And the more we become obsessed about the mechanical universe, the more we kind of lose God. There's only the odd scientist on the planet that kind of hasn't gone that direction. One of the godfathers of quantum physics said that, I'll probably get the quote wrong because it's just shooting off the top of my mind, but he said that if you begin to study science, you will first lose God, but then if you really, really study it, you will refine him in a deeper way than you could have ever imagined. But the split has been devastating. So let's talk about these unseen laws. I'm not going to stick on it, but I'm sure you're curious, okay? So I actually will list them for you. I've got them written down here. The first one, so there's 7. The first one is, and the book on this, the Corpus Hermetica, it's like this thick, and this is a very quick generalization. The first law is the principle of mentalism, that the entire universe is just mental. In other words, it's a huge, orgasmic, perfectly aligned brain. Can you imagine? I mean, that sounds really crazy, but in other words, everything is alive, whether it's physical or so mentalism. So whether you are having a thought, yeah, it is interacting with the entire universe. And what was mind-blowing about this is that they believe that every single thing, which shows up in one of the next laws, every single thing that exists, the darkest thing and the lightest thing that you could ever imagine, will exist within your brain, because we are a microcosm of the macrocosm. So in other words, there's nothing that you need to access that's not within you. That idea has permeated to a degree, but we have very much started to believe in intrinsic evil, which means an evil separate of the one. Okay, so then we go to correspondence, which is the second law. And correspondence essentially is as above, so below, which once again shows what I'm saying with the brain, that the whole universe is inside you. And if you really want to understand God, you must study yourself. And you must look at your own problems, and everything that you need to solve is kind of something that this cosmic mind had to solve, and he's slowing down for you to really appreciate how incredible the balance that is eventually found is. So correspondence is also as above, so below, is saying that if you don't understand how the bigger picture works, you can study the smaller things. And this is a lot where Taoism, and this is a lot where that kind of Buddhist way of thinking. There's a specific faction of Buddhism, but I can't think of it. But they would stare at a flower for until it died, like for 3 months, or they would watch the ocean. And just in getting that feel of how the ocean's calm, and then it's angry, and then it's essentially, they would understand that the whole universe is the same. So that's what correspondence means. These are just ideas, right? So just mull them through. So as above, so below. And also the correspondence, I'm not going to go too deep into it. Then the next one is vibration, which we kind of have a version of today, but essentially what they were saying is the universe is in constant flux. Everything is alive, bouncing and moving, vibrating at a faster rate that you can imagine. Now imagine, you remember that this was written 3,000 years ago and accepted right up until Carl Jung, before we started to lose. So they didn't know about atoms. They didn't know when they looked at something essentially. Well, we don't know what they knew, but essentially they already knew that if you took a microscope and you went into something, that there's actually nothing there. There's a few particles that are more minuscule than you can imagine that are bumping and interacting at incredible speeds. We know that today, so that proves. But thousands of years ago, vibration, the universe is in constant flux and change. Nothing stays the same. Cool. Moves us to the next one, the law of polarity. And the law of polarity is not hard to understand, but you got to remember something, that just like the laws of physics, according to them, could not be broken, they could discover more laws of physics. They believed the same thing about the unseen or the ethereal laws, that this could not be broken. And within this, it explains darkness, it explains everything, because polarity basically says there are no such thing as opposites. There are only versions and extremes of a single thing. Now that sounds so far out, but I'll give you a few examples. When is water, we think cold water and hot water are the opposite, right? But then when does cold water start and when does hot water start? It's an opinion, and it's basically a variable. So what you actually have is water, and polarity teaches us that. Take the earth. There's North Pole and there's the South Pole, but actually there's only the earth. And you get what I'm saying? There's darkness and there's light. They appear to be in opposition of each other. But according to the metacist, they are the same force. That the stronger the one gets, the other polarity will be there to create this beautiful tree, this balance, and each one serving in a perfect way. Very controversial, but polarity shows up everywhere. And an example of why polarity would be such an interesting law for us to bring very strongly into modern spirituality is it therefore suggests the more powerful you become, the more darkness you have to face. So in other words, every time you expand and you become bigger, you would have a higher initiation, which means that back in their day, they believed that the masters sometimes even, and they had the right environments, would sometimes have to go into some form of isolation just to deal with what it is that they had to deal with. Not, oh, this person is so lost, okay. Then, I think number 5, the law of rhythm, which is one of the most dynamic, crazy laws, because essentially, remember that each of these takes hundreds of pages to explain. I'm giving you a very short version, and it's really worth diving into. The law of rhythm is, if you can imagine a grandfather clock, is that nothing in the universe is not on a rhythm. So the sea comes in, the sea goes out. Light expands, light contracts. You will feel high of mood, you will feel low of mood. You will be able to create incredible things, but then when there's a retraction or the wave goes out, nothing will work. So the law of rhythm is how they would accept their changes in mood, how close they can get to God and how far away they can get to God. It's how they would manifest, because they would ride these waves of manifestation when everything's starting to go your way. So the law of rhythm is mind-blowing. And you start, if you're quite connected to what I'm saying, you start realizing a lot of these laws cross over and prove each other. But once again, they did not believe that anyone in the universe that was choosing to take a manifestation of something like what we are would ever be able to break any of these laws. To them, to become an initiate was to learn to ride above these laws. In other words, to not swing on the bottom of the grandfather clock, which is obviously a lesson I'm trying to teach myself, but that would be the extremes. All beings experience it, but an initiate or a magician or whatever word you want to call would be someone that could sit a little bit above it, that they weren't swinging to those extremes, right? So that's rhythm. Then there's cause and effect. And cause and effect is not hard to understand, but you won't believe how deep it goes. Causal rhythm just means that there's not a single thing you do that is not interacting immediately with the laws and therefore creating some set of ideas or principles or experience down the line. It's mind-blowing, but cause and effect goes much deeper because Alan Watts spoke about this a lot. How do you actually know when it began? So you might do something right now. You respond to something, which then puts something in action. But what you're responding to, you have no idea how long that line of events has already been in place. The Eastern version of this is karma. This is not unique to them. This was everywhere. And if you study karma, you'll see once again, this bullshit version we've got going now, it's almost like some gangster that's going to punish people that are doing wrong. The laws of karma in Hinduism are far deeper and more complex than most people explore. So that was their version, cause and effect. And then the last one would be highly controversial nowadays. And remember, I'm just the messenger, is the law of gender. And they believed that the seven law of gender meant that all things will manifest in feminine or in masculine. Now imagine polarity, the law of rhythm, see how they all start working together. And that essentially this was a divine principle because they would create this magnetism between each other. And this is not just in procreation. This shows up in deities. Go and look at the gods. Go look at Hinduism. Go look at the Greek gods. There's this constant interaction. I mean, yeah, I don't want to upset too many people, but it's a known fact that in the Aramaic versions of the Bible, before they moved it into Hebrew, that essentially there was female gods in the beginning. Now, that's something you can go Google. It's something that a lot of rabbis and things speak about. But the point is, gender was the next law. So, kind of to close now, to move to the point I'm trying to make. Can you imagine how lost we would get if we stopped realizing, or taking responsibility for these laws? And that's just if these are the laws, like I just want to open you to how much responsibility they had. There was absolutely no victimization because they were essentially like an initiate because everything was within their brain. Hence, masters would say later on, just know yourself. Just learn who you are, dark, light, your problems, your everything, and everything you will need to know with that special key that the universe is giving you to get into that expansive, all-knowing state, which, according to them, was temporary because there's this rhythm. So what would happen if the split left? Well, I believe it's left us less intelligent because we're either very intelligent on the one side, or we have decided to pick and choose the ethereal laws or the unseen laws. It used to be called cosmic law if you're trying to research this, or it's called the laws of hermetics. And what would happen is nowadays, most of us know that there are things going on in what you could call the unseen world, but we see it as something that is completely open to your imagination or to your interpretation. And it's incredible if you look at those laws. This would take too long. I'll show you even how we got to this idea that you just manifest reality, because it takes away initiation, it takes away everything. Their idea was more that you expand and you contract, and every time you make a breakthrough. So we've got, nowadays, we speak about vibration, and we're like, dude, you're creating your reality. This is nothing like what they said for thousands of years, not even up to Carl Jung, the great, because Carl Jung admitted openly that he was a master of kind of the unseen, like that was his life exploration. And yeah, just give me a second, my throat's getting dry. So to close, I want to give you an example of how getting lost like this might have put us in huge trouble. One of my favorite masters of hermetics, I think it was in the 1600s, I'd have to research, but his name was Paracelsus. And just like we brought up Pythagoras earlier, Pythagoras, it's a known fact, disappeared to go study whatever, versions of hermetics in the secret mystery schools. And when Pythagoras eventually started to become one of the foundation or founders of the Greek mystery schools, he had laws that, for instance, you had to go through 5 years of silence just to get into one of his schools. This is a known fact for anyone who studies Pythagoras. So I want to talk specifically about Paracelsus. Paracelsus had this idea that most people that study philosophy will agree that he got many, many people to a state of enlightenment. And this is the simplicity of his idea. And remember, this is the godfather of chemistry. This is the guy that was the first guy to pinpoint sulfur and right at the beginning of the breakthroughs. And he was doing it like he thought, looking at how God has created these incredible things. So here's Paracelsus' idea. He would find children at a very, very young age that had incredibly big imaginations because, according to hermetics, the bigger kind of your imagination, the easier you could access God, right? And they would teach these children to control their imaginations by giving them the unseen laws and by teaching them essentially how important it was to take in what you believed, okay, and what it is that you accepted as your reality if you were to become an initiate. Now, I personally feel like I've had quite a big imagination in my life and it has driven me insane. And spirituality, unfortunately, helped me in a lot of ways. But I can tell you that I have suffered from psychosis in my life. And whether it is because of my path or initiation, or whether it is because of the fact that I'm ill and it's that simple, I can tell you that I've worked with people that have psychosis for 10 years. And for the most part, I have to try and remove spiritual books and things from them, because if you're in a deep state of anxiety, your imagination expresses in a very dangerous way. In other words, it's just picking and choosing information, feeling good on one day, terrified on another. And I usually have to get them off YouTube. I have to pull their books away from them. And as soon as they start to settle again, as long as they don't flood themselves with new information, their imaginations don't get out of control. So here's a simple example of how our modern flood of information and the fact that we don't want to embody just being human. A human is an intersection point of nearly, according to hermetics, of nearly every part of you expressing through the universe. If these lines all cross at an exact point, they create a physical being. So you are literally like the anchored version of everything that you are. Now, why this would be a problem is think about how your imagination affects you in your life, and think about how anxiety and psychosis and all of these things show up. But essentially, why Paracelsus really blows my mind, which I think is quite a good statement considering what he believed, is that this journey we started talking was about shame and essentially holding space for going into this darkness and understanding these processes of these 7 laws expanding. But where it would leave us is we are in a modern age where most people are pretending that this is not their problem and that they are better than this. And what I mean is, I remember the first time I had an experience of the fact that a part of me comes from the Pleiadian sun. I remember carrying this for years, but I'm not really from here. This is not my shit. And it slowed me down for so many years because I was a starseed child. And then a few years later, and I think they're all true, a few years later, I was this, and you hear people saying things like they only want to interact with animals because fuck humans. And then you hear other things like you hear people divorcing themselves from the human state all the time. And to be quite extreme, I believe that the shamans, as well as spiritualists, have been talking that we are in the era where all the darkness would come home. So this process is happening to us as a planet. And that essentially means that what we need to do to shift and move into this new earth that everybody's like thinking, oh, I'm in fifth dimension already. I don't deal with problems like that. That guy's crawling around on the floor moaning like there's something dark going on with him. And yes, I'm teasing, but essentially we as a planet have to step up, embody, take responsibility, feel the epigenic process of the darkness, love, and gifts that are flowing through our blood. And this is a process of madness and beauty and a process of breakthrough and crying. And this is a complex process that our modern manifesto of spirituality is not holding. And if you are in a place where you hit your darkest period and you can talk about it without filtering it, stick to your organization or stay with those people, if you know what I mean. But this is a very controversial thing. I can tell you that the most important thing that's happened to me is to find people that do not talk fancy talk and are not always, I mean, guys, I'm probably going to upset so many people. I've been watching lately that I personally, as in follow certain people's channels that are energy healing people by touching the screen, and then they speak light codes, and I believe it's all possible. I really do. I cannot see how that's helping a person that's having a nervous breakdown. I've seen how people are dealt with in spiritual communities when people think there's a darkness about them or this is a problem. And I really think that this is a very triggering and important conversation. And I'm going to dedicate the rest of my life to my own process and healing, but also to find a way to make people feel safe and more accepting on the fact that there might be nothing wrong with them. They might be in the throes of a great initiation or breakthrough and etc. And how would this look? I think the closing I want to say is how this would look is you'd fall in love with your humanness. You would embody it. You would realize that most of us have anxiety about the fact that we have anxiety. Most of us are having breakdowns because of the fact that we don't think we should have breakdowns. You know, this is like we have this interference pattern going on here because everybody's selling this idea that you're supposed to be more than you are. How can I be more than I am? I haven't even begun to scratch the surface of what I am. I don't even know what darkness I'm capable of. And I don't even know the light that I could expand to. And it doesn't mean I have to behave in these actions. So, yeah. And I think many ways the path forward is one of people not being on pedestals. One of my favorite quotes I've read recently, and I'm not promoting anyone, I listen to everyone, and I put it in my palette and I see, was Teal Swan said 2 years ago, she said to someone in a thing, she said, hey, if you're looking for a guru, you're in the wrong place, but if you're ready to be human, come sit down with me on the floor. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. Embodiment, not making emotions wrong, sitting with feelings and considering that you're not in a matrix of things that are attacking you. There have been dark influences since the beginning of time. There has always been a dark agenda against you. And if you think that you're in a difficult time now, wait until if you went into the Middle Ages and you lived in France and there were only like 100 people in the whole country that had any privilege and the rest of you were oppressed and fighting. And the pendulum and the rhythm of darkness and suppression has existed forever. We are in the state of perfection right now. There could be nothing better than what you are experiencing. There could be nothing better than the state of the world as it is right now. And to divorce yourself from that is to divorce yourself from God. And I don't mean like in my opinion, I mean it's in your experience. Because if you start entertaining that something's wrong, you're going to think your anxieties are all attacks from things that have nothing to do with you. And if you are having psychosis, you're going to think that you're a lost soul. And if you have a disease, knowing that you don't even know, like what karma teaches us, or the laws of cause and effect, that whole thing could have been put in place thousands of years ago as a perfect mechanism. So I think you guys get my feel. For me, I'm walking into my shame. I am admitting things that I've never admitted. I'm owning things. I'm in love with people that are speaking into their darkness and that are feeling those things and are embodying and are starting to ask the body what it needs because they're realizing that the body is carrying thousands of years of information and oppression as well as wisdom within it. But mostly it's about acceptance and making space now for this great integration of our darkness so that we may ascend and accelerate to just the highest state of what we are. But there can be nothing higher in this moment and in this time than what is surrounding you and what is within you. Thank you, guys. I really enjoyed connecting with you. So I'm obviously talking to anybody on Facebook that watches this at some stage. Contact me if you have interesting thoughts and ideas. I'm going to figure out how to end this broadcast. I'm not exactly sure how. And then I'm just going to have a short chat to the guys in the room. Okay, so how do we do this? I think it's done, yeah. Live stream, stop live stream. Beautiful. Thanks for joining us, guys. I hope that it just triggers you a little bit, either into feeling more powerful about what you believe. I hope that it even enforces what you believe. Or I hope that you just deconstruct and reconstruct in a little way. And how will you know if you're on the right track? If your actual experiences of your life are fitting in with your beliefs, or are the experiences, or are the beliefs of your life that are being given to you and that you're accepting, making you feel on the outside, ostracized, and that your struggle is somehow wrong? That's the key you have to ask yourself. Does it bring you back to your body and present into the perfection, or does it put you in a deeper state of the wrong kind of shame? Okay, beautiful. I think